with all of its messy realities, with all of its imperfect implementation.
Let's get swapped out here. Yeah, so I have been working on my prospecting pitch most of the day, getting things in order. So it's going to be a bit of a chill day today. Hopefully this works. Come on. Come on. All right, there we go. Cool, should be good now.
Implementations with all of its contravening forces and actors, both global and domestic. The frustrating thing is that when I have to defend the real implementation of capitalism as it exists today, I find that I often have to run into the idealized versions of socialism that exist nowhere. Why would we think that would ever happen just because we're in a market socialist system?
That I actually don't know.
This is not socialism.
It is Capitalism versus Socialism. Will Destiny beat Leo? So if you go to that manifold link in the description, as I mentioned, and here, if you want to use your phone and use your camera and take a picture of the QR code, you can actually vote as well, predicting. But you might be wondering, well, how do we actually decide who won, though? Like, what's the objective criteria? We're going to do an in-person pre-debate hand poll and then post-debate hand poll. And it's just by percentage. So if you're leaning even just a smidge for Destiny in terms of capitalism, then you'd slip your hand up. Or if it's maybe you're totally behind him, then you'd slip your hand up too. If you're at 50-50, you're like, I'm truly at 50-50, we ask you to not vote for that vote. If you lean toward Leo, socialism, any degree, we'll ask you to put your hand up. So just want to give you a heads up, that's coming. And we're going to have Ryan counting hands for that. He'll take the percentage. But
do you want to close more deals as soon as next week, possibly? Now, when I say more deals, here's what I mean.
I want to give a huge welcome. Stephen, we'd love to have you come up here. I want to say thank you so much for helping us make this event possible. It's a true pleasure to have you. So welcome, Stephen.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Stephen Gruget. I'm one of the co-founders of Manifold. Manifold is a play money prediction market, and what that means is you can come onto our site and create a betting market on any question that you care about. From betting on events like this, any event you could possibly think of. And through the power...
So there is one just on the other side of this wall, so if you're kind of tired, you're like, sit down and quiet for a bit, just on the other side of this wall. But otherwise, we're going to get started. I want to give a huge round of applause. We're thrilled to have our friends and guest speakers, Stephen and Leo, to be with us. We're going to start with Stephen with his opening statement. Stephen, the floor is all yours.
Oh, that's right. Pardon me.
The poll. Okay. If you lean just even slightly or a lot toward capitalism and Stephen, slip your hand. And if even just slightly or a lot, you lean toward Leo and socialism, could you click?
Well, there's a lot of undecided people, I say.
You got it. All right. Well, thank you very much. And Stephen, the floor is all yours. Thanks for being with us.
Am I mic?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Well, my argument against socialism is pretty simple. It rests on two big points. The first point is that I feel like despite all the promises of Marx 200 years ago, I don't think there has been any country that has actually enacted any form of socialism and has delivered on economic prosperity in the way that it would promise. It seems like overwhelmingly these countries run into problems with either authoritarian dictators taking over or an inability to conduct their markets in an efficacious way, among a number of other smaller or more local economic problems that run into communities that try to embrace socialist or command economy policies. I think that the economic unfeasibility is really bad. I think the second huge part is some of these countries seem to run into a big issue relating to social or political freedoms. You have a lot of these countries, like say China or Vietnam, that end up only having a single party that's allowed to rule. And you end up, by the admission of a lot of people that support socialism or communism, basically an intolerance to other sorts of economic or political ideas. I feel like one of the reasons why capitalism is better than socialism, or one of the reasons why the system works better than socialism, is because capitalism is a larger umbrella that can incorporate multiple different kinds of economic philosophy. So for instance, if you want to do a co-op, or if you want to have your little socialism town, you can do that under a capitalist system. There's absolutely nothing today that stops you from starting a co-op, from getting your friends together and creating whatever type of economic arrangement you want. But again, by the admission of many leftists, some of them quite large on the internet today, if you were living under a socialist system, things like private investment or private ownership is explicitly banned, and you will be sent off to a re-education camp if you try to start a business like this. So I like the economic prosperity that capitalism delivers. I like the social and liberal freedoms that capitalism tends to deliver. And I like that if you like socialism, you can try different forms of economic organization under a capitalist umbrella. And I think these are things that are not afforded to you under any sort of socialist, communist, or Marxist system. That's my opening statement.
Okay. So what he's talking about there is capitalism simply means that the individual or a group of individuals can privately own property, and they get to decide what to do with that property. One of the major arguments that's running around right now is that we should have more co-op type businesses. So for example, Costco. But just by the numbers, because in the United States. Okay. Okay. I want to show you some actual numbers here, because I pulled this up the other day. Okay, so there's around 40,000 co-ops, according to Farm Progress here. Let's see if there's someone else that agrees or disagrees with that. That's just, I wonder if they have it all pulled together. Okay, I'll go with 40,000. So, total number of cooperatives in the United States, approximately 40,000. Number of businesses in the United States. Give me a number here. Give me a number. Give me a number. Come on. This better might be a couple years old, but that's okay. Okay, so listed companies, there's about 13 million companies in the United States. And there's a total of 40,000 cooperatives in the United States. So this is going to be important when this other guy starts talking about socialism.
A1. Thank you for that, Stephen. We're going to kick it over to you, Leo. You got 10 minutes on the floor.
Capitalism is a word that has evoked a lot of different emotions in a lot of people throughout history. What exactly is capitalism? Well, put simply, capitalism is the notion that the means of economic production, the ways that humans produce the things that we need as a species to continue surviving on this planet, is owned and controlled privately. Capitalism has existed for somewhere between about 250 to 300 years. So in the grand scheme of things, it's still relatively new to us. Capitalism has actually done quite a few good things throughout human history. Increases in individual wealth, increases in productivity, as well as technological advances, and improvements in quality of life. Capitalism is not evil to me as it is to many others. However, I would say that capitalism is not perfect, and it certainly has its drawbacks. There is a systematic analysis of capitalism known as the labor theory of value, which I'm going to try to avoid for the sake of this discussion because it is quite technical. But there are a variety of things derived from it, known as predictions, that are made about capitalism and how we can expect it to evolve in the future.
Okay. Something that drives me nuts, especially if you're in a debate, oftentimes when people either don't understand what they're talking about, or they know that it's going to really get the crap kicked out of it of their argument, they'll use a term and they'll circumvent talking about this, because this is actually really important when you're talking about socialism. And it's not hard to explain. It's actually not complicated at all. All the labor theory of value means is that the value derived from the final good or service is because people did work, or the individual put in their labor, which is why it makes it valuable. In capitalism, it breaks those parts down to say, yes, the labor has value, but the resource itself has value. The skill set that you need, excuse me, I'll go back into labor, but it's land, labor, capital, arguably entrepreneurial ability. So it takes a variety of things, and each of those things has value, which derives the total value of an item. Not just, this is a worker, they go, put their doohickey through the machine to make a widget, but it's a combination of multiple variables. So all the labor theory of value says is, hey, you have raw materials, the value is derived from the labor. Not complicated.
I'd like to list at least 3 of these predictions. The diminishing return of capital to the workers in the form of wages. That is effectively just a reduction in wages earned. Over the last 40, maybe 50 years, wages as measured against worker productivity, at least here in the United States, I live in the United States, I can't really speak for other countries, has gone down. The second one would be rising tension between capital owners and the laborers over hours to be worked and wages to be paid. Most people are familiar with the labor movement of the early 1900s, and we have all seen a rising labor movement in the United States today, particularly amongst railroad and auto workers. The third one is the centralization of capital into less and larger firms over time, the notion of monopolization. We have seen this in the fossil fuel industry. We have seen this in the telecommunications industry. We have even seen this in areas of the agricultural industry, where something like 90% of the production of beef is controlled by 4 corporations. So it seems to me that these 3 predictions have come true. And for me, that gives us reason to potentially consider alternatives to the capitalist mode of production. I would say socialism, and I will be defending particularly market socialism, is something that we can look at and potentially implement as a means of transitioning away from capitalism into a fully socialist economy.
Okay. When anyone makes an argument that a mature industry over time is being consolidated, and therefore there's a lot more power being centralized into one place, that is not necessarily because of capitalism. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. So for example, most of the world's oil is controlled by OPEC, which is because of government. For a long time, De Beers had a monopoly on diamonds because of geographic location. Things like Google essentially has a monopoly on search simply because their product's just way better than everyone else's. So when you don't overgeneralize an argument, take some time and dig into the actual nitty-gritty of it, or what's going to happen is you're just going to open yourself up for an attack, because if you generalize something and then if Destiny here walks in with a very specific, hey, what about this corporation, this example, now you're fighting from a more generalized standpoint as opposed to, hey, this is exactly what caused this. Explain why capitalism consolidated those things. Or at least explain what capitalism has contributed in centralizing those things, because that does happen, and there is a good reason for that.
What is socialism? Socialism is generally defined as a mode of production where the workers own and democratically control the means of production. Now, I, being a market socialist, believe in incrementalist policies that are anti-capitalist and that might kickstart this transitory stage from capitalism into socialism. Things like worker cooperatives, single-payer health care, nationalization of a variety of industries, running them like we do the post office, which is a nationalized institution. Things like the telecommunications industry, transportation, having robust public transportation.
Fact check. Is the post office and by the government? Okay. So USPS is one of the post office, is an independent agencies of the executive branch of the United States federal government responsible for providing postal service in the U.S. Its insular areas and associated states. It is one of the few government agencies explicitly authorized by the Constitution. The USPS has a monopoly on traditional letter delivery within the U.S. operates under a universal system obligation. Okay. The post office is a really interesting agency. This is why I wanted to double check it. The reason why is because the argument for the post office, for the postal service, is that if the government creates and subsidizes the post office, it actually increases the tax base. So any money they're putting into the postal service, they're actually making money on the back end of it, which as an argument would actually be a really good reason to keep something like the post office in service. But now, like with Amazon, it's a little bit harder nowadays because like FedEx and Amazon and a bunch of other courier services have popped up and become profitable. So I haven't looked into it in a long time. Maybe it's something I need to dig
particularly at the national level. Much stronger wage and labor protections and an increase in green energy production alongside a nationalization of the energy production industry. Now, I think that these things would do a hell of a lot more for people broadly and would benefit society more than how we are operating today. I want to reiterate that I do not think that capitalism is evil or anything like that, as you might hear from many other socialists. But I do think that what we are seeing today is that humans are technologically advancing beyond the capability of capitalism to meaningfully maintain and provide for the humans that exist on this planet. I think that is why, despite producing enough food globally to feed 10 billion people, there's only 8 billion people on the planet, and yet 5 to 6 million humans die of starvation every year. I think socialism is something that we should all consider and look at as an alternative to the systems that we operate under today. Thank you.
Okay, remember, those people who are starving to death generally live in heavily government-controlled places in the world, including monarchies and including places that are considered communist. Okay? There's not a lot of people who die in starvation in capitalist, democratic societies across the world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leo, for that opening statement. We'll kick it into the open dialogue. Gentlemen, the floor is all yours.
I guess one of the things that I run into that is interesting is when we talk about capitalism, obviously we have problems with capitalism. Actually, before I get into this, do you consider countries like when Mao ran China or modern day China or the Soviet Union, were these socialist countries in your eyes?
No.
Or, no?
No.
Okay. So I find that it is impossible sometimes to defend capitalism in certain arguments against people that advocate for socialist reforms, because what I run into is I don't get to define capitalism as textbook capitalism. Textbook capitalism is perfect. There are multiple competing firms in every single section of the economy. There are no monopolies. The government regulation is absolutely perfect. Wages are always perfectly competitive. Workers get to have employees or employers fight over them for payments, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We all know how capitalism works in a textbook. Most of us here have taken an Econ 101 or a Finance 101 class. That form of capitalism is easy to defend as the best system of economic organization ever. But I don't get to defend that system. I have to defend capitalism with all of its messy realities, with all of its imperfect implementations, with all of its contravening forces and actors, both global and domestic. And the frustrating thing is that when I have to defend the real implementation of capitalism as it exists today, I find that I often have to run into the idealized versions of socialism that exist nowhere. I don't know how it's ever possible or even satisfying for a socialist to constantly say, well, this form of socialism failed, but that wasn't socialism. That form of socialism failed, but that was actually a state capitalist ran by a government. That form of socialism failed, but that was because of contravening capitalist global forces. Every single time you try to point to a successful socialist force, it either wasn't really socialism or it failed for some reason extrinsic to it. Do you think it's fair that for a capitalist, I have to defend the real-world messy implementation of capitalism versus like the idealized, dreamlike version of socialism that has never managed to, I guess, materialize in the real world?
I think practically yes, because the reason that I think that this idealistic form of capitalism doesn't ever obtain is because of the structure of capitalism with the profit incentive. Capitalists simply aren't going to operate capitalism in the idealist sense because it doesn't maximize their profits and maintain their powerful ownership over the means of production. And with respect to socialism, I would say we don't have any successful, I agree, we don't have any successful implementations of socialism, but I think that's because too many people think that socialism is a thing that we can do, when I think that much like capitalism, we didn't just, let's do capitalism now. Human society organically evolved into capitalism out of mercantilism, which itself came from feudalism. And I think that there isn't anything that we can do to make socialism become a reality. Humans will, at some point, probably over the next 150 years, organically evolve into a socialist mode of production. And I just don't know what that would look like. And that's why personally I choose to advocate for a more market socialism that sort of sits as a transition between capitalism and the full-on socialism that I think that you were mentioning.
Okay, so let's actually talk about why capitalism became to be. So the truth of the matter is capitalism and socialism both came out of classical economics, okay? It wasn't they were actually two competing ideas at about the same time. capitalism exists not because, the founding fathers of the United States were like, hey, you've got this capitalism thing, let's do this. That's absolutely not true. Capitalism existed because goods and services have to be organized in a certain way to become most effective. And essentially what happens is that when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, what he was trying to figure out was, well, why is it that prices are constantly going up and down? What are the forces that are causing those prices to go up and down? And he called it the invisible hand. He didn't really put too much emphasis on that. He was just trying to use it kind of as a metaphor. But the reality is what happens is that when you have an industry, or if you're selling a product, if there is a lot of money to be made in that product, there's a lot more people who are going to enter into that marketplace. And then over time, competition is going to drive down the price, because if I'm selling something, these two guys are selling something, you're selling something, and we're all selling the exact same thing, or we're selling a product that is very, very similar, eventually you have to start competing on price, which eliminates the margins. And when you eliminate those margins, you eliminate a lot of companies, and then you have a consolidation of those companies. Then a bunch of people go out of business. You're left over with a few companies who hopefully run things very efficiently, and hopefully you would never completely eliminate that competition. But then those people have to move on to other businesses to try to figure it out. One of the primary benefits of capitalism is that it gets rid of the companies who aren't running things efficiently, and so you end up with lower prices and better products. What he's talking about when they talk about market socialism, usually they're talking about Nordic countries. So if he's going to bring in countries like China, Russia, Soviet Union, places like Czechoslovakia, if he starts bringing in any of those places, most likely he'll jump up and say, no, that wasn't socialism. That was really capitalism, and make some nonsensical excuse. Remember, the history of what's now Russia, what was then the Soviet Union overthrew their monarchy in order to implement communism, which was a derivative of socialism. And if you read the history of the Soviet Union, basically what they realized was, hey, wait a minute, turns out we can't sit here and vote on every single thing. So it makes more sense for people to vote for this group of people, and then they're going to run this thing. The only problem with that is that very quickly people realized, first off, this group of people they voted for, they suck in economics. Kind of like when you vote for either party in the United States, usually they kind of suck at economics. Just kind of how life is. They're not business people, they're politicians, right? Then the other piece becomes is once you give this group of people the power to start to distribute wealth throughout the country, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and they start giving it to themselves, their friends, and their families, and they consolidated the wealth into their own little groups. So it became more beneficial to kiss up to the politician than to serve the average person in the world, which is why communism failed so miserably in every country it's ever been tried. And socialism, it can never get off the ground because it's just a non-starter. It's not functional. Now, that being said, I feel like good regulations and having like little bits and pieces of socialism is probably a good thing. Certain types of welfare, certain types of entitlements, getting people off of zero, that's a good thing. But we don't need this system where we're redistributing every dollar and every cent to try to maximize it because certain people are just better at some things than others.
Sure, so I agree with what you're saying there, but it seems like if capitalism evolved in this like economically Darwinistic sense, if capitalism basically grew out of the feudal to mercantilist to what would eventually become like the global capitalist society, why then, if the next successful and best form of economic organization is socialism, why would we need to enact policies that grossly favor socialist policies and disfavor capitalist ones? It seemed like you were advocating for that in your opening speech.
I think because advocating for those policies and implementing them improves humans' lives. And I think that improving human lives and operating an economic system toward the benefit of humans rather than the mass accumulation of profit would just be better.
Why do we think that, so you talk about the profit incentive, why do we think that market socialism doesn't run into the same issues with these types of incentives?
Well, I think that it probably would, because markets are still present in market socialism, but I think that market socialism is sort of like kick-starting that transition into full Marxian socialism, where I think most of those problems are going to fall away. I think this is just sort of a hypothetical here, that let's say in 150 years humans are living under a fully Marxian socialist economic system. I actually believe that there will probably be some problems there. And then I think that's the point where socialists then, compared to people that would be arguing then for probably communism or something like that, would have to defend socialism with those problems that it would have.
So
Okay, one major issue is that it seems like the argument always has to turn into, we have to have capitalism first and then we'll move that into socialism later. That's like me saying, well, in order to have a democracy, we have to have a king first. It's completely nonsensical. And so capitalism is fully able to start on its own. And that's just a side, that's literally just a derivative of having a republic or a democratic society. If you have a democracy, you are likely living under a high level of capitalism to some extent. Whereas if you are living under a government system, or it's heavy government regulated system, you're going to be under a more communist type of system. So capitalism tends to favor liberty, where communism tends to favor heavy government regulation.
then just to double check this, so aside from the individual workers that might be working at a firm, does market socialism solve anything that's intrinsic to profit incentive problems? Because I hear, for instance, people say like the profit incentive is a reason why pollution exists. But then my question would be, why do we think that that would go away just because that profit incentive is now dispersed to, instead of one owner of a fossil fuel industry, maybe you have 100 workers? Wouldn't they have like all the same incentives to enact whatever environmentally destructive policy there is, because all of them can now profit off of said destructive policies?
I really don't think so. I don't think under a market socialist that everybody's going to be concerned with making more money, because I think that the money that is made, that is produced throughout the economy, would be more equitably distributed and people would probably be more wealthy. And I think that that would reduce that incentive to maximize profit and would allow people to operate economic firms in ways that are geared, even if only a little bit more, towards actually providing for the sake of humans. I don't think market socialism is perfect. I don't think socialism is perfect. But I think they're a little bit better than what we're doing now.
Okay. Notice this little twist. When we talk about a profit incentive, okay, the reason a company has to have profits is so that they can stay in business, so that they can expand, and so that they can produce better goods and services, okay? And here's something a little wild that, if you can deduce this, or if you're in business, makes a lot of sense on the capitalist side that doesn't necessarily make sense on the socialist side. The idea of capitalism is that the individual is going to go out and, because of their greed, they're working to take advantage of everyone else. But if you go into a business and you feel like you're being taken advantage of over and over and over again, if you have competition, you're not going to go back to that business. You're going to go somewhere else because no one likes being taken advantage of. The idea of socialism is that you have to work for the good of society as a whole. The problem is that, first off, no one actually agrees upon what's good for society as a whole, okay? You go to any country with a democratic system and you're going to notice you're going to have at minimum 2 major parties, and you probably have 3 or 4 throughout a lot of different countries, because they disagree upon what's good for society as a whole. This is why politics, there's always so much fighting and there's so much controversy that runs around things, even simple things can get really heated. For example, if you're building a road. I remember years ago they used eminent domain to take, they took several houses out of a neighborhood because they wanted to expand the road. Well, guess what? The argument from the government was, well, this is good for everyone. And of course, the homeowners are going to fight this because they felt that they were being kicked out of their homes, and they were being kicked out of their homes, and it's not fair to them. So from both perspectives, from the city's perspective, yeah, this is probably good for traffic and it's probably good for the betterment of the city. From the homeowner's perspective, well, they're getting thrown out of their home. I mean, obviously they're going to get paid. Big air quotes on that. Who knows if they actually got market value or the right value. But the people there felt like this wasn't fair because they didn't want to have to leave, right? Two different perspectives that both have absolutely reasonable debate as to why they're in the right and the other's in the wrong.
Why do we think that equitable wages would happen throughout society? Like, what's like the mechanism for, let's say we've got a co-op that does janitorial services and then a co-op that does, transportation. What would cause the wages between these two separate cooperatively owned firms to equalize? Why would we think that would ever happen just because we're in a market socialist system?
That I actually don't know.
Okay. So I feel like so here's like a couple of big problems, and then we can go into other things.
Okay, side note for the other guy, I actually think he's a pretty good dude. And the fact that he jumps up and says, I don't know, in the middle of debate, talking about humanizing people, like this seems like someone who's very reasonable, and shout out to him because he seems like a pretty good dude.
So the first thing is that whereas it seems like we both agree that capitalism evolved naturally out of the mercantile system that preceded it, the reason why that evolution happened was because it was a better way of organizing economic forces.
Yes.
Right? Capitalism allows capital to flow highly efficiently from industry to industry. We equalize rate of return throughout society. It's just a really, really good way of allocating, in a very dynamic way, money to different sectors where money can be made, as opposed to the command economy attempts where the government tries to say where the money or investment should go. That seemed to fail horrendously. A lot of socialists, understandably so, back away from those kinds of early examples and say, well, that wasn't real socialism. But it seems that even today we're acknowledging, despite the fact that we could do co-ops in any part of the United States, which is essentially what market socialism is. It's kind of like every single firm becomes a co-op. People don't seem to be gravitating towards that anywhere. I don't see any big leftists making investments into that anywhere. I have a lot of questions specifically on how that form of economic organization would work. Namely, how do you become an employee at a co-op if it requires some sort of buy-in? How do you start new businesses? I think we can go into that in detail if you want, which I'm really curious about. But then the second part is that I don't think that market socialism really solves anything. I don't think that there's any strong argument for why different competing firms in a market socialist environment would have more equitable rates of return of money to different people. Within a firm, maybe 100 people in a firm now make a more equal wage, but there's no reason why competition between firms would solve for the inequalities of wage distribution in the United States, which I think is largely where a lot of these problems come from. As much as people want to say Jeff Bezos makes so much money, I don't think people that are programming at Amazon are complaining about the money their CEO makes. Like, people don't go and work for any of the FANG or any of the large tech firms and are thinking like, man, Bill Gates makes so much money than me. I only make $350,000 a year in total compensation. So I think those are two big issues right off the bat, and then we can go to more. You can, I guess, address either of these two things if you want before we move on to other stuff.
Well, the first thing that I would say about why we don't see people moving into market socialism now and into worker cooperatives is because there isn't much of an incentive to. The economy is already largely controlled by people who have an incentive against that because it would be a threat to the means through which they maintain their wealth and their power.
Okay. One of the primary reasons why people do not move into cooperatives is because it makes absolutely zero sense to do. And let me explain why. So when you start a business, there are a ton of skills that you have to have, and you have to be proficient at these skills. So generally speaking, as a business owner, you have to be good at the things you're doing. So if you're building a house, for example, you've got to learn how to build the house or manage the construction of a home, which is actually pretty complicated. You have to deal with the regulatory issues. You have to deal with the employees. You have to deal with a lot of things. The issue is for example, where I'm a business owner, I've got to line up all these skill sets, and you have to have a lot of these skill sets, which means you have to work a lot of hours, plus you're spending a lot of time learning and adapting to this ever-changing environment, okay? And as the owner, I am the last person to get paid in that company. The issue oftentimes that happens when this idea of a co-op happens is that if I've been working or if I've started a company, I've built this company for 30 years, I take all the risk, I've taken huge amounts of my own capital, I have had to spend years on these ups and downs in my salary. If someone walks into the business tomorrow and they're getting paid $15 an hour as a starting wage, why would that person automatically go to the pay level of the person who spent 30 years working, improving, and perfecting that system? Now, I think, arguably, that person who comes in the company, every person who walks through that door should absolutely have an opportunity to become the CEO or CFO or COO if they put in the time, work, dedication, they beat everyone out. Absolutely. But you should be compensated based upon the value that you're providing to the clients and to that company as a whole. And when you walk in day one, you haven't provided a lot of value, as opposed to that person who started and then had to suffer for decades in order to be successful in that business.
With respect to buying in, I don't think that's how worker cooperatives would probably work. As the data that I've looked at, that's not how people get hired at them as is. And with respect to the data that I've looked at, which it's sitting in front of me, I can cite it if you'd like. Worker cooperatives operate as well, if not better, than traditional capitalist firms. And I do think that they're going to have problems. Like I said, I don't think worker cooperatives are perfect, but I do think that they are. What's that? Oh, I do think that they are a little bit better than capitalist firms. With respect to competition between them, I think there would probably still be competition between worker cooperatives. I don't know if it would be quite as ruthless as it is now, because I think that the profit incentive would be reduced and so would provide for a less of a ruthlessness to the competition. But I also think that there might be more cooperation involved even between industries as a result of decision making at these firms being a little bit more broadened.
Okay, be really careful when you're looking at this is why I looked at that earlier, why I said there's only like a limited number. I mean, there's millions of regular companies and there's only a few cooperatives. So one of the major issues, and I was talking to my sister about this the other day, the number of businesses that you see that are successful, there's a bias to that because you are only seeing the winning companies, okay? All the companies that got wiped out, you're not going to see. So when you look at a worker cooperative, say, for example, I believe Costco or Whole Foods is probably a good example, okay? When you look at those companies and those organizations, you have to realize that they make up a very, very small portion of the market. And the thing is, a company like Winco, a company like Costco, is not really pushing the buck when it comes to advancement of technology, okay? Amazon is probably the most recent company. I guess right now you've got DoorDash and, Fresh. Anyway, these companies are advancing the technology. Costco, Whole Foods, all these places you buy in bulk, which is awesome. Obviously, they're great stores, they're great companies, but you have to look at these organizations did not jump up and rearrange the landscape across this industry. Amazon did. DoorDash is currently rearranging that industry. So we'll see where the technology gets pushed out to.
I think that a lot of people may look more towards cooperation rather than ruthless competition. But I should add just really quickly, I think competition is healthy. Even within capitalism, I do think competition is healthy. And I actually think most capitalists don't really like competition.
Okay.
And I think that's why we see monopolization in a lot of industries.
Sure, that's possible. So we can say capitalists don't like competition, but I mean, a simple question. In your ideal market socialist transition, would capital firms that are privately owned, would those still be allowed to exist?
I think for a time, yes. For me, it would be a slow transition, again, incrementalist, sort of starting with an incentive for new firms to structure themselves as cooperatives, incentives for current firms to structure themselves as cooperatives, and sort of that slow transition with incentives into worker cooperatives, and then say maybe, I don't know, I'm just sort of throwing out numbers for the sake of the argument, 30 years after that, the government sort of mandates that you have to be a worker cooperative at that point.
Okay. Notice how quickly this would destroy small businesses. So you'd have very, very few businesses starting ever, because essentially what you would have to do, if we're going to go with worker cooperatives, so let's pretend that actually happened. The government mandates that all companies are now worker cooperatives. If I'm a sole proprietor, how do I exist anymore? Because I've got to go get a bunch of people together to create a cooperative. So in order to even compete with the company, I would have to go work at a company and then go convince a bunch of people there or people at other companies to all quit, and then we'd have to go branch off and start another cooperative on our own, right? So it becomes very dependent upon this groupthink or this group voting, as opposed to, hey, I want to do this, I'm going to start doing it, and then just find people along the way, okay? Paying people crappy salaries is not a good thing. That's not intrinsic to capitalism. That's not somehow, and that's really what this argument revolves around, is kind of what they're avoiding the question, is simply what would be an appropriate wage to pay someone, and how do you determine that wage?
Okay, so I don't think the argument that co-ops don't start because capitalists are bullying them out, which I'd be curious, like, what even are the mechanisms that are causing that to happen? Because as you said, there are.
I don't think it's bullying them out so much as they're just not doing it. It's not the system we currently live under. That's not what people are looking at. There just isn't an incentive for it.
Yeah, but like, where are all of these employees like clamoring for cooperatively owned businesses? Why don't they just go start them? Why not start a cooperatively?
And I would argue from
a debate tactic, Destiny does this extremely well. Instead of jumping, as you notice, Destiny's he's talking very little. He's just asking questions, poking and prodding. The other guy's just dropping information. So, and he's extremely good at debate. They call him the Ben Shapiro of the left. So you can see one thing he's doing very well is he's taking notes and he's just asking a whole bunch of questions. And I'm sure later on, depending upon how hard this other guy goes, it seems like he's a pretty nice guy, so I don't think he's going to go too hard. He's going to start, he'll start taking all these arguments and start pulling it apart, because all he's doing right now is just getting as much information as he can to make this argument against him, which he's able to do on the fly, which is really impressive.
From a Marxist perspective, that the reason for that is that they're more focused on meeting their immediate material conditions, going to work to earn the wage, to pay their bills, and so they can pay their rent and get medicine for their kids and buy food to feed their families. People are focused on that.
That's a strong argument for working class people. Doesn't explain, though, why you don't see a whole bunch of tech workers get together and make cooperatively owned businesses.
Well, I think tech workers are largely going to be contained in the working class.
You think tech workers are struggling to feed their children, afford medication?
Well, I don't think working class necessarily means struggling.
Okay, I'm sorry, real quick. What is your, because I understand for a Marxist, working class just means you're part of the proletariat, meaning you are an employee that's working somebody else's capital.
You sell your labor power.
Yeah.
And I think tech workers sell their labor power.
Okay, sorry. Because earlier, when you said working class, you implied that the working class are people that are struggling to make ends meet. So it sounded like there was an economic...
It's more that the working class they don't think about these things. They're not really concerned about it because they're focused on other aspects of their lives, like meeting their immediate material conditions.
Gotcha. But even higher members of the working class that aren't just focused on meeting their...
I would argue they still are focused on me. I would argue everyone is informed, their interests are informed by the material conditions under which they live.
Okay, so...
And meeting those.
So even people making high, healthy six-figure salaries and educated positions or high-skilled labor positions, these people are too fixated on their material conditions and immediate
even
needs.
capitalists are focused on their material conditions, but their material conditions are different, so they inform different interests, like investing in other capitalist firms to maximize return and maximize profit and things like that. Everyone, their interests, their material interests are informed by their material conditions, being in different classes. And this is where the concept of class in Marxism comes from, is living under different material conditions. None of us lives the way that billionaires do. So our interests are different than billionaires' interests are, because the conditions under which we live that inform our interests are different than the conditions under which they live that inform their interests.
Okay, I understand the argument, but I guess for me, I'm obviously, as a capitalist, I'm wholly unconvinced. So we have a superior form of economic organization that doesn't, in the transitionary phase at least, promise to address, in the short or long term, any of the big problems in society. This form of economic organization does not have an organic movement towards it like capitalism did. This form of economic organization would require strict government restriction to get there.
I think there would be an organic evolution into socialism. I don't think that we're probably there yet, or maybe we're at just the very start of it, and then over, I don't know, the next, like I said, 100 or 150 years, that gets that transition gets bigger and bigger, that movement gets bigger and bigger, and more people demand better of
Well,
our
I thought if you
economies.
said that like wages are having problems, there's increased antagonism versus bosses, that capital is centralizing, how is this an organic evolution towards socialism?
Well, I don't think necessarily that that's an organic evolution towards socialism, more than it is a sort of people starting to reject the capitalist mode of production, which I would think would come at the start of a transition. These transitions don't happen quickly. Humans didn't evolve into capitalism immediately. That took probably, and I would argue mercantilism was sort of a transitory stage from more of a feudalistic, monarchistic economic system into the capitalist economic system that we currently.
Okay, mercantilism started largely because of the profits that were available for trading between countries. And what really happened when you look back in the past is that these organizations how do I put this in a good way? These organizations existed despite of the monarchies at the time. Okay, remember, mercantilism, monarchies in Europe did not end until after World War I. Okay, World War I was like the final blow to monarchies throughout Europe. Okay, and so all throughout the history of mercantilism, essentially what happened is that you had these workers getting together in guilds, and they were running around trying to make money, trying to be successful, which they had two major problems. These guilds, part of the reason why these guilds were created for two reasons. The first was the actual monarchies, because the monarchs would walk in and say, hey, you're going to build this for me, but I'm not going to pay you. I'm not going to. So the guild got created because workers were not getting paid by the government. The other issue that was going on was with the church, because the church would do essentially the same thing. They would hire a skilled worker to come build a cathedral, to build a church, to build whatever. And at the end of it, they would say, nope, God told me you have to forgive the debt and we're not going to pay you. Okay, big issue. So mercantilism was created as a direct response against the centralization of a government and against religion. Okay, now both I think are absolutely important. They can be really, really great things, but there becomes an issue when your politician or your ruler or your church is exempting itself from the rules of good behavior in society because they have an undominable power for whatever reason, right? Because kings back in the day said, well, I'm a king because God endowed me. I was born into the monarchy, and so this is God saying I should be the king. And the church also had this issue where it was, well, God told me this. And it's like, well, if you're just a worker and you're trying to make a living and trying to feed your kids, how do you fight against that? So a lot of stuff happened because France, Great Britain, Spain, Germany, Portugal, these guys were all fighting for the seaways while you had a lot of battles going on throughout Northern Africa, the Middle East, Southwestern Asia, trying to control the Silk Road. Because if you could sail a boat or take a trade caravan to the Indies or China and come back with, silks and spices, you're making a lot of money. So be really careful when we say, hey, there's this de-evolution or it devolved from mercantilism, because capitalism was a step up from mercantilism, which was created because democracies and because republics started gaining traction throughout the markets and throughout the world, which is why America was the first capitalist nation. Like I said, the founding fathers didn't say, hey, we're capitalists now. We read this book from Adam Smith. No, it's because you go into America and you travel 50 miles inland, there's no government there. So it just naturally evolved through that.
Currently have.
And when we say devolved into capitalism, are you implying that the systems before it were superior, that feudalism was better?
Evolved into capitalism.
Evolved.
Capitalism
Okay.
is certainly better for humans than feudalism or anything like that.
Okay, sure, I just misheard then. I guess then my only other, the only other question I can think of, I guess then, is like, why do you think we haven't seen any country that's attempted to try this transition to socialism? Why have none of these countries worked out? Why have we not had?
Because they've tried to sort of force a transition.
Okay. I'm going to make a prediction here. I think it's going to go one of two directions. Either he's going to make the argument, let's see how right or wrong, I've never listened to this guy talk before, and I did not watch this video beforehand. Either he's going to make the argument that industrialized capitalists came into those countries and ruined it for everyone, or my guess would be is that he is going to make the argument that essentially you have to have capitalism before socialism, and they just tried to move from capitalism to socialism way too fast, which is why it didn't work.
Into socialism, like let's do socialism right now. If somebody tried to do that with capitalism 300 years ago, they would have faced the same problem. They would have failed because broadly, globally, capitalism hadn't caught on. The transition hadn't really started yet. And that's just going to make it difficult. That's what I mean by an organic transition, is that it's not like we all get together and say, all right, it's time to do socialism. It's that starts with this slow rejection of the capitalist mode of production, people wanting something more, people starting to advocate more and more for different ideas, different economic structures and systems.
Remember, if you have a region that has little or no government control, it is naturally going to move into a capitalist society, because individuals are going to have to make decisions for themselves and how to allocate the resources on a small scale.
Systems and implementing them that slowly moves us towards an economic system that's more democratic than what we currently have, such that at some point in the future, we're no longer living under capitalism and are living under a much more democratic economic structure that I would recognize as socialism.
Didn't wouldn't we argue that all of the early attempts at socialism were actually the opposite of that it wasn't forcing people into socialism, that these were transitory stages? I thought that was the whole point of vanguard parties, or the whole point of where China's
I'm
at.
very much opposed to vanguardism. I would argue that vanguardism was essentially trying to force socialism, and that's why they failed. Also,
Well, real quick, what's the difference between that and what you want to do with giving preferential loans to cooperative or market socialist companies and slowly easing back the amount of capital available for capitalists to invest in businesses? Aren't you essentially going to be creating the same type of vanguardism?
I don't think that's the same as like putting people in work camps and stuff like that. I don't think those things that happened like with the Soviet Union and Maoist China and everything like that, I don't think the same problems would arise with the implementation of policies that incentivize worker cooperatives alongside capitalist firms. Like I said, it's incrementalist. This doesn't just happen overnight. And things like universal single-payer health care, robust public transportation, public telecommunications, things that I mentioned, I don't think that's anywhere remotely close to what we saw with the Soviet Union or with Mao's China, or even with China today, which I would
agree with
argue
what
is
you're
like
saying
a
there.
capitalist
Yeah, I
society.
definitely agree with that. But I don't think any of those things are remotely closer to socialism. I don't
either. Market socialism, it is a bit of a misnomer because you still have markets, you still have commodification, there's things like that. But there's a much more democratic control over the economy than there is right now. Workers, these people in here that have jobs, don't really have much of a say over where they work, what that firm does.
Okay. The term market really refers back to price, okay? How much is being sold and at what price is it being sold at? But here's the grand question. Who controls the price of any good or commodity? If you're corporation, you cannot control the price. It's this misnomer that these greedy companies are just going in and they're changing the price. Companies have far less control over prices than what people realize. And it's always a struggle with companies to try and figure out what should we be selling this item for. Because prices, for example, I was selling an item once upon a time, I was selling an item for anywhere between $2,000 and $2,500. And you would think that, $100 on a $2,000 product, $100 wouldn't be that big of a deal. But I'll tell you right now, the difference between $50 or $100 on a $2,000 product would mean it would go from no one wanted the item to I would have a line of 50 people trying to buy this thing for me. So when you say market, this is why Adam Smith referred back to the market as an invisible hand, because he recognized and realized way back when he wrote that book that no individual is controlling the individual prices of anything. It's simply, unless there's one world government controlling the entire global economy, which it doesn't, but at any given time, no one is controlling prices of something globally. It doesn't happen.
So the CEOs, the executives could choose to lay off a bunch of people and move those jobs to Mexico, and none of those people have any say in that at all. Whereas with the worker cooperative, that would be put to a vote for the workers. Hey, are you guys willing to give up your jobs so that we can send them to Mexico? Most of them would probably say no, and then that wouldn't happen. So it's just, let's make the economy a little bit more democratic and see if this kickstarts this movement into a fully democratized economy, lacking things like decommodification and some of the other features of the capitalist system.
Gotcha.
But I don't think this is going to happen overnight.
Okay.
or
To be
anything
clear,
like
when you
that.
say more democratic, what you really mean is like less democratic for certain areas of more democratic, right? Because right now, if anybody wanted to create a co-op or a market socialist operating firm, you could do that anywhere. But in your idealized system, the one we're making steps towards, private ownership and private investment would effectively be illegal, right? You would never be allowed to do
At
that.
some point, that would probably be the case.
Well, necessarily, right? It would have to be the case.
Yeah,
right?
at some point, but not like right away. It's not like, all right, we're going to make private investment illegal, and you can, because that would just completely destroy our economy. So we can't do that, and that's.
I didn't mean it. I just mean it's a tad ironic to refer to it as a more democratic system when certain ideologies are not only necessarily incompatible with the state, they would be banned from certain forms of economic participation as well.
Well, I don't think those forms are themselves democratic. So I think that at some point eliminating non-democratic forms of economic investment would be better for people.
Okay. I think that's my back and forth. I don't know what else you want to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or how much time do you want? Yeah.
Yeah. Timer break quick there.
One prompt is, Leo, isn't it a leap to assume socialism is the next step in economic evolution? Why not assume it would be some other yet thought of system?
Because capitalism is an undemocratic system of economic control, and the next step would be one that would be democratic. So any economic system that is democratic, where the workers have that broad democratic control over economic production, would just be socialism. And to me, that is the next step. I would want to hear an argument for what would be the next step other than that, and what kind of model that would be and what it would look like.
Any thoughts on the other side, or did you want to move into Q&A?
I mean, I take issue with the idea that like a firm operating under. So when we talk about incentives for firms, we talk about incentives for unions are a good thing. I think
Yes.
people run into this issue where they think worker equals good and firm equals bad, instead of just firm is the firm and the worker is the worker.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I hear
Capitalist firms are just firms. They don't do anything. It's sorry to interrupt, but it's the workers, and then I would say it's the owners of the firms and their interests that they use the firms to meet that creates the problems. And so one of the points of socialism and one of the points of Marxism broadly is to eliminate that class of individuals that has that much power over the society, such that they can use the economy to meet their interests, which I think, as we have seen plainly, comes to the detriment of societies broadly.
Sure, that can happen, but I don't feel like there's been a convincing argument made on the other side.
Okay. This idea, so he's chasing a boogeyman here in the sense that if you're an owner of a company, you're bad because you were successful. That's the argument, right? Is that it doesn't matter if you started as an immigrant, not speaking English, dirt poor, came over as a refugee, busted your butt, learned to read, learned everything, and now you're a multi-millionaire, and then you employ tens of thousands of people. You are evil or you are bad because you were successful. Okay? And therein lies the problem. And it's really just a form of the bias, just the bias there. You should never judge a person based upon. You should only judge a person based upon the actions that they've taken in order to be successful. If that person came from nothing and now they're super successful, awesome, good for them. But if someone came from everything, and let's say daddy gave them $10 million when they're 18, and now they're 48 and they still have $10 million, they didn't really achieve anything. That doesn't mean they're a bad person necessarily. I would assume that you're kind of lazy if you have $10 million 30 years ago and they still have $10 million. But you need to judge people based upon the actions that they've taken. Business owners, like everyone else, are just people. There's a lot of good people, there's a lot of bad people. And you need to look at their lives and stop classifying, hey, this group of people, right? The obvious bias. And we do that. I mean, we'll complain about it, about like race or gender or where they're from or skin color, whatever, whatever it is. But it's like that one thing, this is okay to be biased against this person because of their success. And it's really, really problematic to view the world in that way. And to be fair, the business owners that I have known that came from nothing, not necessarily the business owners that it was handed to them, but the business owners that absolutely started a business, came from nothing, they are some of the most wonderful people you can meet because they understand the grind, they understand the plight, they understand the difficulties, they understand what it's like to have nothing, and they remember it. So yeah, be really careful when you're just saying, hey, this person's bad because they're successful. Like, maybe take a look at where they came from and take a look at what type of person they really are.
That organizing these firms, taking away the capitalist owner and then distributing among the workers, because people associate workers with good. They think that more democratic, better for the workers, both of those things are almost certainly true, is going to be better for society. I don't think that's ever been demonstrated. I don't understand why there would be any mechanism where that would be true.
You don't think the democratization of economies, like we've done with our governments, would be better for society like it
I don't
was?
think.
Okay. A company is not government, and a government is not a company. And we've turned this, especially over the last few years, we've turned it into this weird thing where, oh, they're both the same thing. Absolutely not. They are two very different things that need to be run very differently, okay? Good example. If you are KFC, there is no reason why you should be transparent there's no reason why you should be transparent about your chicken recipe, okay? In government, they should absolutely be transparent as to the legislation that they're passing and the bills that are getting written to legislation, right? Two very different things.
For our governments?
I don't think necessarily that follows.
Well, I would say I don't think it necessarily
What I'm
follows
saying
either.
is all we're doing is we're shifting around some of the incentives, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these incentives are going to align in a way that's better for society. All it really means is the incentives are probably aligning in a way that's better for the workers. Now, if you're a worker in a particular firm, that's good.
And
but
most people are workers.
Most people are not workers of every firm in the United States, though.
No, but most people are workers rather than owners.
That's true, but more people buy from privately earned companies than work for different types of privately earned companies, right?
Of course.
So, for instance, we run into issues in parts of the United States where labor unions that are representing workers might be blocking the implementation of green energy programs. This has happened, or at least when I lived in California, there's a big deal in California that the AFL-CIO, the largest collection of labor unions, fights pretty stringently at times against certain implementations of green energy policy because there aren't going to be good jobs there for some of their workers. So this would be an example where the laborers themselves are actually standing in contrast to what would be better for all of society because they're representing their own interests, which I want to be clear again, it's not necessarily a bad thing for workers to represent their interests, but I think it's a mistake to pretend that just because workers are representing their interests, all of society will be better off for it. Workers don't represent the interests of all workers. People that are working as a police officer in a police union are not representing the same interests as teachers working in teachers' unions. And there are times where the unions can actually be at odds with the contravening population sentiment as well, right? We'll see, for instance, in local elections, how important it is that you have to, you've got to bow out and basically give a ton of concessions to emergency service unions. At least in Omaha, where I was from, that was a really big deal that if you're running for mayor, you have to have the firefighters, the cops on your side. So there are times here where labor unions or workers in general, labor in general, could be advocating for things that are not in a good thing for society. So the idea that we want to make a huge transition from one form of economic organization that is undoubtedly superior to the form that came before it, undoubtedly superior to the attempts at socialism, if I grant that they weren't socialism that existed in other parts of the world, that we want to abandon that and try a whole new form of organization that doesn't even have the underlying mechanisms necessary that even theoretically would address societal problems, but that we want to actually start to make that transition using a combination of government policy and capital controls, and then we want to phase out capitalism in favor of this other form of organization that would make illegal capitalism. I find that, that line of argumentation it feels very heavily ideologically driven in a very negative, not willing to confront reality kind of way.
So,
okay, more simply put, he got really wordy there. The easier way to explain it, let's pretend that in this new system, everyone's a good person, everyone has the best in heart to make this successful, okay? Me as an individual, if there's an issue going on where I live in the West Coast, if someone on the East Coast has an issue, I do not know about that problem and about that issue. But if we're running everything completely democratically, then my vote has to be involved in what's going on in that person's life, okay? Democracies are great for government because there is a level of transparency and because certain issues happen at local levels, happen at state levels, happen at federal levels, and happen at international levels, okay? When they're running, for example, if they're trying to have a treaty with the UAE, I know nothing about that area of the world. I have no expertise. I should not be voting on that issue because I know nothing about it, which is why local elections are so incredibly important, because most of the time the big things that are affecting me are oftentimes happening at a local level. And once you take care of those issues, then things at the state and then at the federal level oftentimes have much less impact on my life because what's happening locally, for example, like zoning laws or taxes or how the police are handled or firefighting or something along those lines, often affect me on a day-to-day basis as opposed to something that got passed in some bill through the federal government, which probably doesn't affect me as much, okay? Which is a significant issue, but you can't, me as an individual, because I really don't have any pull in the world, I can't be screaming at the federal government on the internet because there's no one there to listen to me. I'm not organized in such a manner that I'm going to have any effect. However, if I go show up at my local mayor's office and go talk to him or her, well, they just had an election, or they're having some election today. But if I show up to their office and I am actively talking and working with this person, I can have a lot of influence because I am physically there to work through problems with that individual.
Well, one thing I would say is the mechanisms for capitalism didn't exist under monarchism or feudalism either. They slowly came about as humans began to evolve organically into different ways of organizing the economy. The mechanisms for socialism do not exist currently because we don't live under a socialist economy. Again, that organic evolution has to sort of happen of its own accord. I'm just advocating for policies and sort of not... I don't know if I would say that market socialism is a completely different mode of economic organization, but I would say it is different from capitalism. But that's why I argue for incremental changes like that don't shock the economy rapidly, which I would say would probably cause economic collapse globally.
Sure. Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
You keep saying that you're viewing market socialism as just a transitory thing. So is your goal at the end for every price control and every all labor and everything to be ultimately dictated by like a form of central committee? That every labor is sent to a particular firm, that the cost of everything, all the wages are eventually set by some central governing body?
No, I don't think so. To me, that would be more of maybe like a statism or something like that, and I consider that different from a socialism. Because we
what
don't
is market socialism transitioning to then? Because my understanding is the reason why it's called market socialism is because your economic organization eliminates the private ownership, but the prices of goods and labor is still largely set by market forces, and that's why it's called market socialism.
Yes,
so what is
yes.
your market socialism transitioning to if not full socialism,
Well,
which
full
I believe would
socialism-
demand a form of command economy where wages and prices for goods and services and everything are set by a central body? Or yeah, you can tell me the difference.
Well, I don't know if they would necessarily be set by a central body under full socialism because I don't live under full socialism. I don't actually know how it would play out, just like people living under monarchism couldn't have known how capitalism would play out. So again, it's just, and this is one of the big things about socialism is we can define it, but we can't say what it's going to look like when it manifests. Just like under monarchism, they couldn't have known, they might have had an idea of this, private ownership over the economy, but I don't think they would have known what that would look like when it manifests in the world as we do now.
Sure, and then final point, we keep saying they wouldn't know, they wouldn't know, they wouldn't know. The difference is nobody had to make government policy saying we're banning socialism, we're only doing capitalism, we're banning mercantilism, we're only doing capitalism, we're banning kings and queens, we're only doing capitalism. Capitalism grew because market forces are real, they're powerful, and that form of private organization just eventually exploded around the world and overtook what was there before it. We didn't have to, there didn't have to be a government policy massaging capitalism early on or banning competing forms of economic organization. It just took over.
Okay. The reason why capitalism took over is because as a whole, it's just way better for everyone. Okay? No matter which way you slice it, people make, under capitalist systems, people fare much better than any other system economically to date. Hands down. There is zero, absolutely zero debate among that. And if you are arguing that, you're either a liar or you're just completely blind to the rest of the world. Okay? The more capitalist as a nation, the better off you're going to be economically.
Over. The difference here is that you are suggesting a move toward socialism using preferential government policy, meaning you're disfavoring the current capitalist organization. So you are asking to move against where I guess the markets want to be right now. So I don't think it's satisfying to say, well, they didn't know that capitalism would be like this. Like, yeah, sure, but nobody in the beginning was forcing the early economies to transition to more market-based systems. So I feel like it's a bit different there.
Yeah, I just think that forcing the systems to move today is just a benefit if we can force them to move in directions that better meet the needs of the humans that exist on this planet. And I think that there's probably ways in which...
If you're thinking of selling your house, want to know how much more you could be getting by using this brand new way to sell? The real
government...
Okay. I gotta cut out, go to the gym, and then I've got stuff to memorize for tomorrow. Good times. Anyway,